Hey, JJ, did you hear about American cyclist Kristen Faulkner?
I saw like clips. I saw the clip of her like passing everybody. I don't know the full backstory aside from the fact that like she shouldn't have been there or something. I did see it though. Yeah,
so she was just in finance 5 years ago, and then in the morning she was like, I'm just going to take up cycling as a thing to do. And fast forward 5 years, she's in Paris. She is a substitute for the Americans, so she wasn't supposed to be in the race, and then she just wins gold. So it got me to thinking, if there's any obscure events that I can just start getting ready for here in LA in 2028, and I went through the list, but unfortunately, the IOC does not have being overweight on Tyrone Tracy.
I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years, but there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have. And I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest. And I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro. Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. Only a handful of these things left. I'm JJ Zacharyson, joined as always by Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, buddy?
Doing good, man. All these camp reports keep coming hot and heavy. We're obviously going to get into the Aiyuk news, but man, every day I check these beat reporters and I'm just crossing my fingers that we don't get any major injuries as we enter into the first week of preseason here. But yeah, feels like, and I feel like we say this every year, but it feels like the news has been more hot and heavy this year than it ever has been.
Yeah, and I will be honest, I feel like the news hasn't favored my takes as much as I want it to favor my takes. No, yeah. You know, it hasn't been
pour one out for DeAndre.
Yeah,
Kamani Vidal's career is over.
Yeah, right. I get more irritated, honestly, when I see, so like the news items happen, whatever. I get more irritated by not how I internalize that stuff, because I usually just kind of can brush it off and not really let it impact my rankings and stuff like a dramatic amount. I just get really annoyed when other people start piling on and then making fun of you for liking a certain player because of what happened from a beat reporter, what a beat reporter saying in late July, early August. Like, I saw many tweets. So Kamani Vidal got injured and, you know, he was playing behind Jarrett Patterson the one day. And, you know, I've been someone who liked Vidal, but I'm not like, I don't like Kamani Vidal because he's simply in that backfield, which I think is like the default for some people or some of the adversaries who say you only like him because of that. I thought he was a good prospect. Go back and listen to late round perspectives with Matt Waldman. Both of us were really into Vidal. Like, we were talking about him and, you know, we both had these like DeAndre Swift type comps for him. And so I liked him as a player, and then he landed in a good spot. So that combination, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to like this dude. But what annoys me most is when people go to Twitter and they say things like, imagine liking Kamani Vidal, like after the fact, or like after a beat report. It's like, why are you doing this? All you're doing is alienating 50% of your audience right now and making them annoyed at you. That's the thing that annoys me with that stuff.
Yeah, people love. I mean, first of all, Twitter is just such a cynical place that anytime any news comes out, people are going to go for the joke in that aspect. So yeah. And it was pretty clear with Vidal, yeah, why we liked the player. It wasn't just that three-headed backfield, but
sure.
Yeah, you guys were in love with the player, and what it was is opportunity was the accelerant for liking the player. It wasn't the basis of it.
Yeah, right. And I think with a lot of like day three, and this isn't even me saying like I'm pivoting off of Vidal. I'm still okay with him. But the thing with like any of those players is that you can go out and say, draft him. I really like him. But everyone who listens to that kind of advice, and this goes for any advice that I give, ground yourself with what that really means. It means that at cost, we like this player. And, if you look at day three running back hit rates, they're not very strong. We shouldn't expect the world from the dude. Chances are Kamani Vidal will not do much at all in fantasy football in 2024 from an odds perspective. But we're also layering on cost and ADP, and that's when a player becomes a little bit more attractive. So yeah, I mean, the news stuff this time of year to me is more I get more annoyed by how people interpret it rather than what the news item itself is, like what the beat reporters are saying. They're just doing their job and injecting their own opinion. It's how that opinion is then taken as fact that just annoys me to no end.
The other thing is consistency, and I'll bring this up and we'll get into some player stuff here in a second. And you brought this up on the mailbag, and I thought it was a terrific point where people are excited about Tyler Algier, and somebody asked, how does that affect Bijan Robinson? Well, the same excitement is going on in Jets camp right now with Braylon Allen, but it's having no effect on Breece Hall.
Right.
So we kind of have to apply these things across the board and not one by one, or else it's just going to really color our analysis in a negative way and kind of create some biases that shouldn't exist.
Yeah, I mentioned this in the interview today, and I'll just bring it up as the example again right now. But I think a really good example of like when you look at coach speak or you listen to what they're saying in the media, there's a lot of positive buzz right now around Kenneth Walker as an example. Okay. The thing is, no one should be questioning whether or not Kenneth Walker can run the ball well, or if he's explosive, or if he has burst. Like, we know that exists for Walker. The question mark for Walker is whether or not he can be a pass catcher. He hasn't hit an 8% target share in any season yet that he's played in the NFL, and he had a lot of question marks as a pass catcher in college. Like, he hasn't been a high volume receiver. Maybe he wasn't even in high school. I have no idea, right? Like, I've never seen him be a high volume receiver at the college or professional level. And so when they come out and they say, yo, he's crushing camp. Well, yeah, he's the kind of running back that probably would crush camp because he has a lot of that burst and explosiveness. But also, I want to know how they're deploying him as a receiver. That's what's most important. If we got word, not the stuff like he's a 3-down back or we think he can be a 3-down back. That's just kind of like a generic term that coaches and people use all the time for players without really thinking what that really means. I want to know what he's doing specifically as a receiver for me to say, oh, he does have top 5 running back upside, right? With Zach Charbonnet in that backfield. So it's that kind of dissection that I think a lot of people need to be doing, with this stuff. You can definitely take away some items and change your rankings and change the way you play players, or you rank players and draft players based on what beats are saying, based on what, these news items look like. But to me, it's a lot easier to do that with late round picks where, it doesn't matter if you're wrong. Whereas if you're going to go,
volume is so important with those players where we're talking about guys that like, they're either on it's kind of binary with some of those late round players. Like they're either going to see the field or they're not going to see the field.
Exactly. And so like, you can give like a slight bump. Like I'm probably going to remove Kenneth Walker as a player to avoid this week in the draft guide because there is some positive buzz, but I'm not going to then all of a sudden make him a target, because that's going in a very extreme direction. Whereas I was only like 2 or 3 running back spots away from market with Kenneth Walker anyway. It wasn't like, I might move him up 1 or 2 spots, but it's not anything like dramatic. I just think that you got to try to be level-headed about it, ground yourself with it, and just don't be stupid with the information that's out there. That's really what it comes down to. One thing I want to get to before we talk about some of the news items and some guys I'm drafting right now. Greg Bryant, longtime listener
Let's go, Greg.
of this show and of Living the Stream, he wants to donate 2 draft guides. Okay. So the people who are listening to this episode early, yes, you're at an advantage because I'm going to give you a promo code right now that you can go to lateround.com, go purchase the draft guide. When you do that, there's a little discount code at the bottom, promo code at the bottom. You can insert it and apply it, and then you'll get it, the draft guide price will go down to $0. The promo code is Thanks Greg 2024, all undercase. Okay. Thanks Greg 2024. The first 2 people to do that. And now I'm assuming this show goes out at 6 a.m. Eastern, whenever we publish this thing, every Wednesday.
RIP West Coast.
So yeah. So I'm sorry to the West Coasters. It'll probably be kind of rough for you to get this promo
There's
code.
Somebody out there. Somebody out there's a runner that they're up at, or their shift is ending.
That's right.
And they're getting home.
Yeah.
Come on, West Coast. Come strong, baby.
I want whoever gets this guide or one of these 2 guides. There's 2 of them. So the first 2 people to do it will get it. Whoever gets it, I want you to hit me up on Twitter or email me, and you can use podcast@lateround.com and tell me where you're from because I'm curious. Like I would assume both winners are going to come from the East Coast is my guess. That's my guess, but we'll see.
Europe? Forgot about Europe. Get in there, Europe.
Europe, yeah. The Europeans, yeah, they'll be eating lunch. But 3 days later, whenever they hear this. But yeah, the promo code is ThanksGreg2024. It's not for the prospect guide. It's for the draft guide. That's a $25 value. Greg wanted to donate these two to support, me, give back to the community. He's a great dude. And I greatly, greatly appreciate it. Okay. There's two big items that we need to talk about here, Rich. The first one being Brandon Aiyuk, right? We don't know if he's been traded by the time you listen to this, but at this moment, he has not been traded. And the three teams that, maybe even two, maybe the Steelers aren't really part of it. There's a lot of conflicting reports, but I know that you seem to think that the Steelers are firmly in it.
My guy.
Because
Pretty Ricky, you
are a pretty Ricky truther. Rich Ryan is.
The king, Pretty Ricky. Get it right.
And obviously this isn't a totally real take, but maybe it is. My stance is it's very strange that San Francisco is willing to do this, right? Like, am I wrong in thinking that the 49ers are forcing this a little bit and they could be screwed in the process? The only way I see this working out for them in the short term, because they're in win now mode, is if there is a deal in place that they get Amari Cooper and they're able to do something with their cap and make things like, I'm not a cap expert. And then, Aiyuk goes to Cleveland. They at least, San Francisco is still getting an alpha in return. But if you're trading with New England, there's been rumors that Kendrick Bourne is involved. Like, that's a huge downgrade coming off an ACL too. And then if you trade with Pittsburgh, they have no one that they could offer you to fill that role. So yeah, I'm in a weird place right now with this whole Aiyuk thing. I didn't think it was going to get this far, to be honest. So that's already an L from my perspective. I didn't think that they were going to let him go. I didn't think that he had like amazing leverage, but I do think he's an important piece of the offense.
Real quick, right as we started recording, Schefter reported that the Steelers and Niners re-engaged in conversations midday. Pretty Ricky, the absolute king. On a serious note, the reason why I've been following Ricky with some of this stuff is that with some of the news that he broke during free agency, it seems very clear that he either works with or is adjacent to some sort of agency or knows somebody that works with or adjacent to an agency, because a lot of the news that he breaks seems to be on the player side. So if I'm reading this situation completely, it seems as if Brandon Aiyuk extending is as important to the process as the trade. So he needs to, with the trade partner, agree on some sort of extension before anything.
Right.
So it would therefore make sense based on the history of Ricky that maybe he knows something about Aiyuk's agency and the type of deal that they're looking for, and maybe that the Steelers might have something in place. But again, the news itself will come out. In terms of the deal, and to me, this just reeks of like humanity in football, where there are certain things that we really can't analyze, where if there was just a burned bridge between Brandon Aiyuk and the Niners front office, it really doesn't matter what capital or what return or what deal, like it's over. Like these humans do not see eye to eye, and there's just nothing that's going to come of it. It reminds me of the Jets and Elijah Moore last year, where you have this great young player. He's an amazing fit in the offense. He's done a ton with garbage play around him. It makes so much sense to keep him around with Aaron Rodgers coming in. But there was just a burnt bridge there. Yeah. And there was just no coming back from it, so they shipped him off to Cleveland. So I think that's ultimately what's happening here with the Niners. Yeah,
and I think from a fantasy perspective, wherever Aiyuk goes is probably a downgrade. I think Cleveland could be okay if they do ship Amari Cooper the other direction, because I'm bullish on that offense. I think Cleveland's going to throw the ball a lot. I've been drafting Cooper a good bit. And I think, from like a fantasy perspective, I don't think Cooper going to San Francisco would be a massive downgrade either. So it'd be a nice, like neutral kind of flip. The thing that would suck is all of the correlation and team stacking and game stacking that we've done with those players all of a sudden, gets blown up. But, if Aiyuk is gone and they don't bring on a significant piece, Deebo Samuel becomes the top piece that you want at the top of the second round. We've been trying to find the player that is obvious at that turn, and there's just a giant tier. We've been drafting Drake London and Marvin Harrison Jr. and sometimes Jalen Waddle and Chris Olave, But I think that Debo probably just breaks the tie because he could see a really high target share without Brandon Aiyuk in the picture. And we know that he's a pretty good best ball bet too. If there is sort of like a rotation going around. And don't sleep on George Kittle. Like George Kittle all of a sudden becomes a solid 5th round pick. If Aiyuk is gone and no one steps in, like what's the difference between George Kittle and Dalton Kincaid? Right? Like I would probably rank Kittle. I mean, this is off the dome. I haven't really looked at like projections or anything, but Kittle might be a better asset. He definitely jumped Kyle Pitts, but he might be a better asset than Kincaid too. So right now I've been trying to, in the drafts I've been doing, I've been trying to force it a little bit with those guys. Other teams have done that a little bit too, but like I got Debo at like 204 or 205 yesterday. I looked at my exposure, and the last episode of this show, I plan on you and I just talking. There won't be a guest, but what you and I will do is kind of just walk through where things are at from an exposure standpoint, the things that we learned, all that kind of stuff. But exposure wise, I didn't realize it, but I haven't been that high on San Francisco. Like I've wanted more George Kittle throughout the entire summer. I just never, the teams that I need him, he gets sniped right before me. And then the teams that I don't need him, when I went tight end early, he falls, but I don't need to get him because I already have a tight end. But my exposure has been about 10% Debo so far. I say so far, like we have like 3 months left. We only have like a couple weeks left. Debo's at about 10% and Aiyuk is about 6%. So I'm not that upset about that, but I do think it's going to end up blowing up a lot of these stacks if there is a move that happens.
I think my favorite take of yours was from 2 weeks ago. We should start throwing some late round dart throws on Juwan Jennings. You just did in a BBM. I mean, this is a guy in the playoffs, 6 targets against the Packers, 2 targets against the Lions, 5 targets in the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Guy scored a touchdown.
That's the call though. You're right. Juwan Jennings is the pick right now. The 18th round dart throw with Ricky Pearsall. We don't know what he's going to be about. He's a rookie, obviously. He's going to get a lot of love, but they like Juwan Jennings, and he's a solid enough player that he could give you some spiked weeks.
And speaking of Pittsburgh, we've had a little bit of a quarterback controversy over the last week or so. Some glowing reports coming out about Justin Fields. He's moved up 18 spots in Underdog drafts. Russell Wilson has dropped a hair, down 3.5 spots, and perhaps the introduction of Brandon Aiyuk makes things a little bit spicier for whomever is under center for your Stillers. So what are your thoughts here? Who have you been drafting? Have you been drafting either? What you got here, JJ?
I am feeling a little bad that I don't have that much Justin Fields. I'm not going to lie. I wish I had more. I wish I had listened to some of the people who were pretty vocal about it. I didn't though, because of 2 things. Number 1, I thought it was going to be Russell Wilson's job. And it still might be. Number 2, the quarterback position, from everything that I've talked about to the guests on the show and such, the quarterback position is the one where you're not going to see that big of differentiation, even if the quarterback hits and has a good season, right? Like, yes, you'll see spiked weeks, but you can get spiked weeks from a lot of different quarterbacks and a lot of different weeks and a lot of different variety, right? So I didn't feel the need to like force the issue. I think I only have a few shares of him through BBM, so maybe like a 3% or something, 2% with Justin Fields. But I'm to the point now where I'm okay with getting him in round 15 plus. I saw him, my live stream yesterday that I did, he went in the 13th. So that's too high for Justin Fields, in my opinion, because we're still in a scenario where we don't know if he's going to start. And speaking of like the Kenneth Walker could look better in practices, Justin Fields is like the definition of that.
Who's going to look better in shorts?
Like Justin Fields, a guy who, I know that Russell Wilson has struggled against pressure as well, but Justin Fields struggles against pressure. He's this athletic freak. I'm not surprised that he's going to look better, or like look good in practice. Like that hasn't really been his issue as a pro. But yeah, this Russell Wilson injury opened things up, period. Bottom line. If he hadn't gotten hurt, I don't think any of this would be happening right now, but he did. And I think that it also opens us up to the realization of what would happen if Russell Wilson got hurt in season. And then it's making people realize that they should have more Justin Fields. So this was a good learning for me from a best ball standpoint, because like this is one of those situations where from a redraft season long perspective, you do not need to draft Justin Fields in most cases, right? You just wait. Okay, if he starts, or if you get positive news, you add him off the waiver wire. You compete with others with him off the waiver wire, and you kind of go from there. But in best ball, you don't have that ability. And that's something that I wish I would have jumped on earlier than now. So it was a mistake for sure in hindsight. But, it might end up being where, Fields doesn't play, doesn't start. Or what if he's the starter for the first 12 games of the season and then they pull the plug with him because he's not performing that well or something. And then Russ finishes the season. So that's another kind of gal brain way of thinking about this too. But yeah, I think overall, just given anytime you see a player rise or fall in ADP, and you're higher or lower on that player and it goes in the opposite direction of where you were, it's an L, right? Like that's a loss. And so I've lost a little bit with Justin Fields because I'm not as overweight as I wanted to be.
Yeah. I'll always be somewhat of a closet Russell Wilson truther. He tied CJ Stroud in composite score last year, EPA and CPOE. And what's interesting to me with Wilson is that historically, he's always been a guy whose EPA is higher than his success rate because he's so good on the deep ball, right? He throws those moon balls and has these splash plays where it's the in-between that there's some struggles. But in a best ball scenario where we are looking for spike weeks, even if they're a little less frequent at the quarterback position, that's the type of player. Like we're enamored by the Justin Fields upside with his running, his athletic ability, but Russ still has the ability to go out there and just throw multiple 50-yard touchdowns, just absolute moon balls to George Pickens and score some points.
I've said from the start, I think Russell Wilson fits this Arthur Smith offense very, very, very well. Like I think that he makes a lot of sense as that player. But look, if Fields ends up performing well and they want to start him, we got to play that game and we got to understand that. And obviously, Justin Fields as a starting quarterback in the NFL is a top 10 fantasy asset because of what he can do with his legs.
All right, two players you've been drafting a lot this week. This first one, super surprising. So we have the DeAndre Hopkins injury. I believe the terminology is out 6 to 8 weeks. Knee sprain that puts it into the beginning of the regular season. Obviously an older player. RIP to our DeAndre Hopkins bags. But for some reason, this has not changed the way people are drafting Calvin Ridley.
Yeah, it's really strange to me. So before the injury, I was at 18% Hopkins, I want to say. So he was one of my higher wide receivers. And then I was at 11%, I think, Calvin Ridley, because I'm high on the Tennessee offense. Like I think that it's an undervalued offense that could score more points and throw more touchdowns than what's being projected. I'm surprised though when DeAndre Hopkins goes down and this injury happens and they're saying he's questionable basically for week 1. Calvin Ridley's ADP has not changed. He's still a 5-6 turn.
2 spots.
Yeah.
2 spots.
2 spots. Yeah. So he's still like a late 5th round pick. Whereas I'm okay with taking him where Terry McLaurin goes, like in that 4-5 turn area. So I've been getting him in the middle of the 5th round pretty frequently. And I feel like, yes, it's an early season injury for DeAndre Hopkins, but the dude is old. And I think there were a lot of reasons to believe that he was really undervalued because his peripherals were actually pretty good last year, but he's old. Like this is like, let's just be realistic. This is an injury related one, but this is another L for my portfolio because now he's dropped to, the late 7th instead of the early 7th. And that's somewhat of a problem. I did talk about this with our guest today, a little bit. And I think there's a really interesting take that he throws out there. So I won't get into that, but in turn, I have been drafting more Calvin Ridley because his ADP hasn't really changed.
We'll talk about a camp all-star here to close it up. He's playing in the same Cincinnati offense we talked about with Mike Gesicki previously, and that's Andre Iosivas. I always want to go Yoshi, the Mario fan in me, but no, Iosivas. Talk about him. Yeah,
look, I thought that he was an okay prospect, but coming from Princeton, you can never really have super, super high hopes for someone like that. But with Cincinnati, it's an offense that I've been investing in. I have a ton of Chase Brown. I have a decent amount of Zach Moss. I've drafted a lot of Jermaine Burton. And then obviously, T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are very good players. But and then Mike Gesicki as the one that you've been, who you just threw out and who we talked about a couple weeks ago. So with Iosivas, this is a situation where he might end up manning the slot and playing like that Tyler Boyd role. I do think that we should ground ourselves in knowing and realizing that second-year players who didn't do a lot in year 1 usually do not pan out and become like league-winning types. I do not think he's going to be a league-winning type because not only, is he probably not as talented as other wide receivers, but Jermaine Burton's there, who I think is really, really talented and might force himself onto the field eventually, and they have to like deal with that. But with that being said, this is one of those instances where camp news and camp hype is totally fine to let sway your opinion, right? Because it's a good offense, there is an opening, and he's a last round pick, or like, he'll maybe go in the 16th or 17th round. That's fine. There's not a big difference between those kinds of picks anyway. So I've been taking him, especially in my Cincinnati stacks, but I've been taking him even without Cincinnati players just to piss off whoever drafted Joe Burrow.
We got to tilt them back. They tilt us every single time. We might as well get some tilted drafters out there.
Anyway, I have teased this a little bit. There is an interview today with Mr. Jon Warner. It was a really fun interview. He's a Badge Bro at the Badge Bros on Twitter. Plays a whole lot of best ball, a lot of different formats and different sports as well. He's got a lot of knowledge to share. But we talked about training camp news, how he uses that news when he's drafting. He gave his take on the quarterback landscape. We talked a little bit of weekly winners, which is something that we haven't really gotten to that much on this show. I thought that he had some really interesting strategies there. It was just a really enjoyable episode. He brought and dropped a lot of knowledge, and he gave a perspective that we really haven't heard on this series so far this summer. So without further ado, here is my chat with Jon Warner. This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. If you haven't played over at Underdog yet, now's the perfect time. There are tons of different best ball leagues that you can join, and there's definitely a league out there that fits what you're looking for. And you can use all the things that I've talked about with guests on becoming a best ball bro to crush those drafts. But like I said, now's the right time to join up. Because if you go and you sign up and use promo code late round, you not only get a nice deposit offer, but you also get a free late round draft guide. That's a $25 guide emailed to your inbox after signing up for absolutely free. So head to UnderdogFantasy.com, sign up using promo code late round, and make a deposit. I can confirm it's a really, really fun platform to play on. Now back to the show. All right, Jon. So training camp is happening right now. Lots of news flying around. We don't have to talk about the speculation, with Brandon Aiyuk and that trade stuff that's happening. Because by the time this podcast goes out, he might have been traded. We have no idea. But with training camp news, I like to ask these questions to Kez, at least recently, because training camp started. What is important to you, and what's important enough to you to sort of like shift your draft strategy in these best ball drafts? Like, what is it that you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I'm somewhat cautious, like pretty apprehensive when it comes to training camp news. I guess the 101 will always be like injuries. That's kind of like the easy answer. Running with the ones in quotations is always one that piques my interest. Some coach speak stuff, as long as it comes like directly from staff and stuff like that. But I kind of fade the FUD around like the clickbaity videos, the intern made depth charts, who's having a good camp in parentheses from, some sideline beat reporter. I kind of sift through all that stuff and take it all with a grain of salt, because I think it's really easy to overreact, like, especially now, given the fact that like we have the most immediate time loop cycle that we've ever had, right? Like you'll go in a room and, we could use Deonta Foreman from the other day as an example. And it's like he gets carted off, and now all of a sudden, like Jerome Ford goes 25 picks above ADP, like instantly 15 minutes later, because we're more tapped in than we've ever been. And the feedback loop is so much faster than it's ever been. So, I mean, it's kind of a boring answer. I'm a big, like, wait for the preseason guy, but I'm also like just a big, like, cautionary tale guy, because you don't have to go that far. Like, we could go back to last year and be like, Sean Tucker was getting buzz right now. Like, yeah, Rachaad White had one of like the best ADP relative to running back seasons out there. Same with Tank Bigsby and Estime. Like, it's so easy to get caught up.
Yeah, I think another thing, I've been seeing reports. I think this is just an example, right, of something that I look at with the news items and stuff, is that like we have data on a lot of players, so we kind of know, not like rookies and even second year guys per se, but third year and beyond, we kind of know who these players are, right? Generally speaking, one of the guys that I think is most intriguing this year from like a storyline perspective that's kind of being shoved under, like just not being talked about that much, is with Kenneth Walker, where there's a ton of hype within like the running back coach talking him up, and the coaching staff talking him up that, this could be a monster year. He's been the best player in practice and stuff like that. The one piece of caution that I throw out there, and this is someone that has a lot of Zach Charbonnet bags, so I'm saying this, take this with a grain of salt. I don't think Walker's like a horrible pick or anything like that. I just really like where Charbonnet goes. But regardless of all of that, the one thing that Kenneth Walker has always needed to become a true, like take the next step as a fantasy football asset has been pass catching, right? Like he's been under the 8% target share per game mark both seasons of his career. You go back to college and he wasn't much of a pass catcher in college. Like that's the piece to his profile that we want the most. And none of the items that we're hearing from the coaching staff specifically says that. If they were to come out and say he's absolutely going to see more receiving work, I'm not even saying like, oh, he's a 3-down back, because that's just kind of like a term that people loosely throw around. I'm talking specifics about him catching passes out of the backfield, because if that happens, yeah, he can be an RB1 in fantasy football pretty easily, right? But instead we're hearing, we know that he's a really good running back. Like we know that he's really good on the ground. What we need to care about is what he does through the air, as a receiver. So I think, taking everything with that grain of salt, and not really taking everything to heart is really, really important. I think it is interesting, like you said, how we get like these immediate reactions to this news, Jerome Ford being a great example. And then a lot of times the news items aren't even relevant. Like they don't even matter at the end of the day. I don't know what's going to go on with Deontay Foreman, because it's just, obviously that's like a scarier kind of, injury that, we don't know what it might do to his like mental psyche or something like that. But yeah, I mean, like it is interesting that we get that immediate reaction. Now, as a follow-up to all of that, another sort of like immediate reaction you could have is these rookies, second-year players really stepping up and performing well in camp. I think two examples of that right now would be Johnny Wilson out of Philadelphia, who is, I thought he was a pretty interesting prospect because he's this like Chase Claypool type player. And then there's Jordan Whittington, who's getting a lot of love out of Rams camp. And then, we know what happened last year when the rookie wide receiver got a lot of love out of Rams camp. We get a Puka Nacua season. My question to you, though, is in these instances, you can get these guys in the 18th round of an underdog draft. Like you can get them at the tail end as afterthoughts. Are you leaning into that because the costs are so low? Or are you saying that's still a roster spot and I want that roster spot to be used on someone who can most definitely produce?
Yeah, I mean, this might contradict my cautionary tale from the previous notion, but I'm extremely fluid with back end ADPs. Like once we get beyond like the 15th round or something like that, I will be scrolling and matching and moving all over based as I see fit. I think they're two really good examples because of like, we've lacked a third wide receiver set for like Philadelphia for like a long time. Like we've wanted Quez Watkins to be a guy. Yeah. And, we can, I think the biggest takeaway with this is like, we can debate till we're blue in the face based on like profiles, draft capital spent, and all this stuff on whether Jalen McMillan and Luke McCaffrey and these types should be, drafted at 100% frequency. Whereas, Whittington and, Johnny Wilson should be drafted at a 15%. Like there's right. No way the mean outcome or median outcome between those two endeavors reflects the ownership right now. So why not just start scrolling to, using the Whittington one as an example, like what does he have in front of him? Even if we, imagine him fifth on the depth chart, which he very well could not be. It's like he has an undersized slot wide receiver who couldn't keep Justin Jefferson. Yeah, he definitely couldn't keep Justin Jefferson off the field, but he could keep Van Jefferson off the field there. He's got a 30-year-old breakout in DeMarcus Robinson in front of him who's on a 1-year deal. Sure, he got handed like a decent chunk of change, something like $5-6 million or whatever it was. But like, what's to say that this kid from Texas who, yeah, he probably couldn't get on the field with Worthy and A.D. Mitchell, but like these guys were first round caliber prospects. Like, we've seen this narrative before. If they play the most 3 wide receiver sets in football, why not just tack them onto my Stafford stacks in the 18th round? Because I think it's really important to remember that like there's a lot of good research that's been done, like that zeros on your roster are bad. Like, yeah, duh. right? But like once you get to like week 17, it's like the importance of having no zeros. Well, in the middle of, June, July, early August, like we have no idea where those zeros are going to come from.
Right.
They don't we love to manufacture the narrative that those zeros are going to come from, rounds 15 through 18, but that's not the truth of the matter at all. Right. So, we think we're replacing a tangible asset in the 15th round by taking a swing on someone like this in the 18th round, where like the inverse could be true.
Yeah, the argument about not taking zeros has always been this summer, as I've been talking to people about it and drafting, in more volume. It's been one that I've struggled with because I feel like you make assumptions based on what the market is saying, and you're making an assumption that a 14th round pick or a 15th round pick is not a zero, whereas anything after that is a zero. But realistically, if you look at any historical ADP versus points per game chart, once you get into the double digit rounds, but let's just say round 12, round 13, your hit rates of getting genuine production start to really, really crumble and fall, right? But then on top of that, I feel like if you end up, and maybe I'm wrong in thinking about this way, but I feel like if you end up with the don't take a zero mindset, you also may not be drafting players that have enough variance and volatility to their profile. Is that a wrong way of thinking about it?
I mean, if it's wrong, I'm wrong too. So
that's good.
That's the way in which I think about it too, is lean into the pendulum of variance, right? We're going to make a finals in BBM specifically, once in every 7 years. I'm going to take an ownership discount at a player that's part of a 3 wide receiver set on a potentially top 5 scoring offense in both their cases, right? Over maybe shooting the moon at someone who's 100% owned a little bit lower.
Yeah, and I also think there's a way to balance your own roster. This is like for instance, and there are more obvious examples, than a rookie that's going in the 18th or something. An obvious one is Nick Chubb, let's say, where we know there's an injury, we know there's objectively there's volatility to what could go on with Nick Chubb, and so on teams where maybe you go with a couple running backs early and you feel really stable there, then it might be a little bit easier for you to take that chance on a Chubb, as opposed to if you go more zero RB and you do need more of a floor potentially. And maybe, again, this could be the wrong way of thinking about it too, because this is much more of a season long way of thinking. But maybe if you do go more zero RB, you lean towards a Jerome Ford a little bit more because you know that he'll play the full 17 games hypothetically, as long as he doesn't get hurt in the season. Is that sort of the way that you think about things too?
Yeah, and I lean into it even further. I like that you brought up the Chubb example. I've been using TJ Hawkinson.
Yeah, right.
Trying to build 2 elite tight end builds where I take an early elite tight end and then just tack on TJ Hawkinson and nobody else. And I don't, add that third one for the safety net. And I just shoot the moon on being he's ahead of timeline. What if I just have 2 top 5 round picks on this team at the tight end position, right?
Yeah, especially if it's a tight end with a late bye, right? Where they hypothetically could just play 11 or 12 weeks straight and get you production. And that tight end's not going to, that makes a lot of sense. I wish I would have been doing that. I wish I would have talked to you earlier about that one in particular. So I would have been drafting more Hawkinson, in June and July.
I don't know. Some people have called it fake sharp, but I'm leaning into it a little bit with Hawkinson and with Isaiah Likely in the same narrative. Just in terms of if things break right, and most likely that comes via injury for Likely, but if things break right, you end up with 2 week over week top 10 tight ends on your roster.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The Likely stuff has made sense to me. And I've also kind of hedged a little bit because I love Andrews and I like where he goes and such. So it's easier for me on non-Andrews teams to just sprinkle in some Likely just to get some exposure there. But yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, especially in a position where that the range of scores are not very great. So it's not a big deal if that one tight end that you do have as sort of your anchor with a Hawkinson, if they have a dud week, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine we're going to talk about, I'm jumping the shark here. We're going to talk about weekly winners in a minute or something there, but you only needed 10 points from your tight end to make your roster 89% of the time.
That's crazy.
10 points.
Yeah, that's crazy. All right. So speaking of all this camp stuff, has there been a player that you've moved most, let's say, whether up or down? It can be in either direction since camp started.
I'll give you one per each position. Okay. The first one is Justin Fields. Just the calf injury with Russ opening the potential door that he could start sooner than expected. Like, we've been giving him the Trey Lance treatment, where it's like we've just buried him and he's a backup now and nobody cares kind of thing. Like, we've kind of lost sight of the fact that the amount of slates he broke last year, I think it was 3 on our site. Maybe it's 2. Maybe I'm misremembering. It was 2 that he broke. But like, in terms of fantasy points per game over the last 2 years, like, he's a top 5 player. Is there any cleaner path? Like, if we think of last year, it could have been one of like the greatest outliers ever for back end picks with like Kyron, Laporta, Puka, Trey McBride, right?
Yeah, Tank Dell.
Tank Dell. Is there any cleaner path at the back end to an isolated week being broken by a player than Justin Fields simply starting?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot more 3 quarterback builds than I had done in the past and just tacking on Fields in the 18th. And now he's getting a little steam and getting pushed up the board. So I guess I kind of took him from, by moving him up, I've taken him from like not being drafted to being drafted. And now I'm kind of comfortable chasing him, I guess, to like that 16, 17-ish and taking him over like the Daniel Jones potentially, if I don't have like a Neighbors or a Wandell or a back stack that I'm trying to set up. But yeah, that's one at the quarterback position for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean the field stuff has been really interesting. I saw him in a best ball. I was doing a live stream yesterday. He went in the 13th, which is, to me, that's the opportunity cost there is actually like not insignificant. But yeah, once you get to the final 3 rounds, I think that's when it makes sense to throw that dart.
Yeah, absolutely. The other ones, Chase Brown at the running back position. Yep. Just when a receiver coach starts talking about never seeing improvements of this magnitude from a player, it stands out to me. And that was a backfield that I was trying to ape into early. And I was on the Zach Moss side of the equation for a long time. And now I'm kind of like counterbalancing my bags. And I think I'm kind of like 15% one side, 13% the other, because I just know I want those expected fantasy points and touches inside the 10-yard line that Joe Mixon used to get. I don't really care who they come from. I rarely pair them together, but I do kind of like treat it as some other people are treating like Chiefs wide receiver right now, where it's like, oh, I just want one on every roster in case of that ceiling outcome. I'm kind of treating that backfield as such now and pushed up Chase Brown a little bit. Other one was JSN. JSN for me, I'm like, Mike McDonald can't go to the podium without talking about JSN and his route tree and how dominant he is. I think he got a raw deal last year, both in just like, I don't want to say archaic Shane Waldron offense, but I want to say like not as forward thinking as like vertically stretching as like Ryan Grubb was at UW. Yeah. So I like that notion for JSN. And then I just like the fact that he's going to be there for a full camp this year. Like, he missed all of preseason. He had the wrist thing. He came back maybe earlier than expected. Like, let's just ape into the fact that this guy is as talented as his draft capital indicated from the previous year.
Yeah, and Tyler Lockett's another year older, and he took a little bit of a step backwards last year. Like, it makes sense that this would be the JSN takeover. Is he going to outscore DK Metcalf? I don't know about that, but I'm not like, there's some people that are like very, very, very into Metcalf, which I understand because I'm bullish on the Ryan Grubb offense for sure. I mean, there's going to be a lot more verticality to it. I think they're going to run at a better pace. And the nice part with Seattle is a huge reason that they didn't do that much offensively or do as much as we thought that they would offensively last year is because the defense was horrible. They could not get off the field. And so they didn't run that many plays. And so I think with a defensive minded coach and some changes there, they could be better defensively, which could also in turn help the offense just run more plays just in general. Yeah,
it's a really good shout I hadn't even thought of. That's a good
Yeah. All right. So this time of year, we also get injuries. One of the injuries, for instance, that we've heard Puka Nacua recently with that knee. There's also DeAndre Hopkins with that knee. And now Hopkins, his week 1 status is kind of up in the air. I think that I'd say, let's just say it's 50-50 that he plays week 1. But when we hear these things happen and we see these things happen, how do you sort of shift your mentality, with a guy like Hopkins, for instance? Do you full out fade? Because one of the very interesting things that's happened that I'm surprised at is ever since the DeAndre Hopkins news, Calvin Ridley's ADP really hasn't changed. And I mean, I shifted him up a little bit because I think that there's at least a little bit more ambiguity going on with Hopkins, and there could be a higher target share, all that. I was pretty high on Hopkins too before all of this happened. But, Calvin Ridley's ADP hasn't shifted. So is that something that you would then attack because it hasn't shifted? Or are you going after DeAndre Hopkins because you're saying, look, yeah, he's not going to play weeks 1 or 2, let's say, but we're going to need him in weeks 15, 16, and 17 most. And he could easily play those weeks. And we know that it's DeAndre Hopkins and he's still a good football player.
Yeah. It's a loaded question because I'll answer it two ways. I'll answer it from like in a vacuum portfolio management style, and then I'll answer directly what I'm doing with Hopkins. Mm-hmm. The first one for me, like from a portfolio management standpoint, is like the chalk answer is going to be like, if I was buying before, I'm going to be buying the dip now, right? If I wasn't before, I'm going to be fading. And this is what creates a news nugget like this, an injury like this creates the CLV or lack thereof in a given thing, right? For me personally, on the Hopkins one, I was buying before and I was treating him, I had him ranked adjacent to Ridley. I don't have very much Ridley. I had a lot more Hopkins than I did have Ridley.
Same.
I viewed them, similar there. Now I'm trying to build out, I'm not trying to buy fully. I'm trying to build out combinations that I didn't previously have with him on the other side of the board.
Yeah.
So in my own rankings, I've moved him 9 spots. I should probably move him like 15 or something, but I want him to be up there in the range in which my combinations don't have him on the other side of the board. Now that's like a BBM specific mindset and conversation. If we were doing like a time box contest or something like that right now, I would just try to catch him as far as he could possibly fall.
Yeah.
Like, as far as he could possibly fall.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a little worried, and just because of the age associated with him, but I mean, we had our question marks about that offense in general. So I'm not really trying to be like time to ape Calvin Ridley now. I'm kind of like confirming my priors that, okay, like, just taper your expectations and maybe I'll mix in a little Ridley here. But I think in a vacuum, it's a risk tolerance exercise, as is like exploitative versus balanced exposures is, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's just the pendulum variance in which you want to allot capital toward, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like I was still getting some Ridley, and so I'm okay with still, and I'm saying this out loud because again, this whole entire podcast series is me becoming a best ball bro and trying to make sure that my process is right, and maybe others would have, the same thought. But with Ridley, like let's say I was overweight on Ridley. I think I was at like 10 or 11% with Ridley before all this happened, but I was at like 19% with DeAndre Hopkins, before this happened. I really like the point though, because I think that the mindset automatically goes to, oh, I have enough Hopkins, he's going to fall around an ADP. I don't need to like aggressively attack it, but I do think that it does make sense from just a game theory perspective to say, okay, but other people are now benefiting from the falling Hopkins that you're then not going to benefit from, even though you got a lot of him. And then I also like the nice part, and maybe this is just because the market is doing what you're saying and that they want to get these different combinations. But the nice part with Hopkins in particular is that he was a tail end of a round pick, right? Because he was a 6-7 turn guy. Now he's more of like a 7-8 turn guy. So your team composition is almost entirely different from one to the other. So you can get really unique combinations. So I think that's another reason why what you're saying makes a ton of sense. But is that like, should I be leaning into Hopkins then even more, you think, just from a game theory perspective?
From a game theory perspective, yes. From a risk tolerance perspective, that's up to you.
Yeah, right.
So me personally, I'm going to lean in on the other side of the board associated with it. Like I was at 14% before because like, there's this weird thing about like CLV, right? It's both like a fictitious anomaly that might not matter at all when you finally play out the slate. But then there's also this other avenue to it where if you don't absorb it when you thought something was good beforehand, you've put yourself at a great disadvantage, right?
Yeah.
Because now essentially all your Hopkins pairings are, in quotations, worse, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. So along those lines, though, like let me ask you about like Rashee Rice, right? So Rice was like an 8th rounder, 7th round, whatever, and now he goes in the 5th round pretty consistently. But you could argue that a non-suspended Rice, before the NFL draft, he was a 2nd round pick. I think maybe because they drafted Worthy, he'd be like a 3rd rounder. But a lot of the 2nd round is just so up in the air that you could easily see if they came out and said Rashee Rice will not be suspended this year, like I could see a scenario where his ADP is in the second round, right? In those scenarios, like let's say that you didn't get a ton of Rice. I was kind of at market, so this doesn't really apply to me. But let's say that you didn't get a ton of Rice when he was like an 8th round pick. Now he's a 5th round pick. Does that mean that you would still be fading Rice because you faded him when the price was lower and other people were taking advantage of that?
Not always. It's a case-by-case basis. If I still think the player is undervalued at a 5th round value, now that we have like definitive information, then I'll go in on it, right? Like, because I do tend to agree with you that we would be having like the Rice versus DK Metcalf debate if we knew the suspension was off the table right now, right? So with that mindset, I think he's still undervalued, and I would do stuff like pair. Maybe I wouldn't catch the 8th round value of him, but I would do it in like some other combination of like just doing like him plus Mahomes at like 4-5, like at 3-4 on the other side of the board, or something like that, where it's like it's a little gal brain and it might be cutting like value in quotations, but like at least my version of that team is going to be like better, or not better. It's going to be different. It's going to be uniquer.
Right. No, that makes a ton of sense. You talked about the weekly winners format briefly. That's one that I really haven't touched on this show. So my question to you is, how are you approaching that format? What's the most important thing or things that people should think about, as they're drafting within that format?
Okay. From a, bird's eye view, like just rattling off some points. I think there's definitely a premium at the onesies positions. I think there's a premium on upper echelon quarterback. I think you can play ones at the onesies positions. I think I'm not sure it's optimal, but I think one at the quarterback position is a very viable strategy, especially if it's one tethered to rushing floor. Like you've talked about rushing floor a lot on your show. That pays huge dividends in like just maintaining weekly score for some of those premium quarterbacks, that you can still compete even if you don't hit the nuts. Like you can still have a winning week with a given lineup if you have that baseline score, and you don't have to spend like 3 pieces of capital at the position. I think the pendulum swung a little too far last year, and maybe I was part of it, and maybe I was wrong in some of my stuff. I was doing some like overstacking and like doing like, three pieces tethered. So as long as like Baltimore's offense went off, I encapsulated that or something. I think that was probably wrong. I think some of the other things that we may or may not have gotten wrong, but make us feel smart, are like stacking all the bye weeks together so that we have like live rosters for all the other weeks. I think you might just be aping into bad ownership at that point, and it's maybe not as big a deal. I think stacking like divisional opponents so that your like correlation patterns always have like a bring back or something, I don't think that matters as much as it once did, or we thought it did. I think pushing up running back, because I think you should always want to aim to separate at quarterback with premium scoring and win the flex via running back. So I think something of the more robust variety. But for me personally, this year, I've really gone to backdating my drafts, getting them all in at the latest window, and then targeting the earliest weeks when we have the most known information. So,
gotcha.
Yeah. So like taking like less immediate zeros and then being hyper focused as like a week 1 bro, or like a week 1 through 3 bro, when we know like the most.
Yeah. So in that scenario, then are you like fading Jonathan Brooks in those formats, and then you're just attacking, getting like Chuba Hubbard or something like that, and that just so that you get that early season production?
100%. Especially if I like the game environment, or I like the implied team total, or if I like, there's like a couple like front end teams that all kind of like pair well together, that all have like high implied team totals as well, like targeting like Miami and Detroit and stuff like this in the front end just makes like so much sense to me.
And you're doing that because you have the most information for that period of time, and there's payouts weekly. That's what weekly winner is all about. But you're doing that because you have the most information as possible without injuries happening, right? And your lineups not just blowing up. Because if you already won in week 3 or week 4 or something, then you're good to go. It does, like, who cares about week 13?
Exactly. 100%.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a definite piece of advice that folks probably haven't really thought about that much. Go ahead.
There's one other contrarian one that I really like that you kind of alluded to with like the Chuba Hubbard notion and that sort of thing. I like doing like a full 0 RB build where I go premium quarterback, maybe 1 or 2 premium tight end at the onesies, and then I do like a 5 wide receiver start, and then I just go full 0 RB, so kind of like counter indicative to the reverse or to the robust RB one I talked about earlier. But I try and pinpoint like front of week game environments and like contingent upside, because I think of like, where does good chalk come from on like redacted site? Like it comes from 4K running backs, right? Where is the most insane volatility? Well, I think of like, week 17, week 18 slates that we played last year, where it's like we're debating Ronnie Rivers and Jordan Mason as top 10, top 12 options, right? If I can find something like that at the front end with like a Miles Sanders as like RB 75 or something like that, I want to ape isolated scenarios like that in specifically 0 RB builds. Would
you be more inclined to maybe take a chance on a running back in those scenarios, or are you still just kind of getting like the front end, like a Miles Sanders or a Chuba Hubbard, like the front end boring veterans?
Probably lean like 60-40 boring vets, 70-30 boring vets, target the Foreman, target the Sanders, like that sort of thing. There's definitely a place for like contingent shoot the moon upside, but I think those pair better with like 3 robust at the start of draft and then contingent at the backside of that.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. The quarterback landscape seems pretty efficient this year. I like asking this question to people because I look at ADP and I'm like, oh yeah, this makes sense. Oh yeah, this makes sense. But how have you been attacking quarterback this season?
I've been a premium quarterback, bro, thus far. I've been doing a lot of it's kind of boring. I've been doing a lot of 3 wide receiver starts, then doing like tight end with doing Andrews Lamar or doing McBride and then catching Kyler on the way back, or doing a Mahomes plus insert wide receiver or Kelsey there. That's kind of been my like standard build. That being said, I've done a lot more 3 quarterback builds than I've ever done before, because I've kind of thought through the value of, winning week 16 and some of the stuff Leone talks about of like, if we aim to optimize for a week, win week 16. And then what gets us through there is matching basically what got everybody else through there. So how do we differentiate now? Well, the easiest way to do it is with a 3rd quarterback skinny stack. So that's just something that I've been thinking through with the inevitable. If we ever get there, maybe at least we have another out with a stack. So that's something I've been doing. Maybe it's reactionary to how many injuries there were at the quarterback position last year and how many guys got like meaningful snaps last year. But yeah, that's kind of been my macro is premium quarterback with a skinny stack at the front end, and then tacking on a 3rd quarterback late. I'm entirely fine with.
So are you getting a 3rd quarterback with an elite quarterback, or is it mostly 3 quarterback with like a Trevor Lawrence or even like a Jordan Love, let's say, as your QB1?
I mean, with Jordan Love in particular, I'll take 3 quarterbacks. With, I've done like a handful of like Mahomes early and then like Bo Nix Fields to close. Or like, something like that I'll do. I'm trying to stay clear of like pairing QB4 with QB10 with QB25, right? That's just too much capital.
It's a lot of capital. A lot of capital at quarterback. Yeah. What's something that you feel that best ball drafters get wrong in the way that they think about this stuff?
This one for me stems from the daily streets, because we play 250 slates a year, maybe something like that on our show. We play every single sport. We see everything, start to finish, and we see basically an isolated BBM slate take place every single day, right? In terms of like the arc of things take place. So I feel like that's a long-winded way of saying like chasing historical data is just like in a vacuum bad, because we're only on the 5th slate ever of BBM, right? So once you see like how a given day plays out, like if we just use we could use a football week, for example, in terms of like our contest, right? The contest drops on Underdog. There's this early ADP CLV window everyone tweets out all these amazing combinations that won't be available later in the week, what we call the GM. And then all of a sudden in the middle of the week, you get a big news dump, a shift, guy misses practice. Now as someone has a Q tag, it shifts the values of the combinations which can be obtained. Then there's a late inactive or a scratch, and there's a huge value shift of maybe a running back now is going to get 20 touches, or now all of a sudden someone who was projected as wide receiver 30 should have been drafted every single time all week. And then we watch 4 to 8 hours of football and we see it play out. And then we see that a whole bunch of one-offs with no correlation and no bring back and no nothing win the slate. Yeah. And it's like, well, I'm not going to build like that next week. So hat tip, let's move on. Doesn't matter. There's definitely some principles associated with BBM that I feel that way with right now, where it's just kind of like we've been a little spoiled. Not that like the people that have won aren't deserving of winning. They're phenomenal players and they're really tapped in the industry, but we're a little spoiled that those people have won because now we just think we have all the answers, right? It's like, that makes sense. Yeah. Guy from ETR wins, guy from Leg Up wins. It all makes sense. All the answers are, this is the playbook, right? And it's like, well, let's pump the brakes. We're still only on the 5th iteration. They figured it out before everybody else did. Maybe they were correct and everybody has been correct up until this point, but maybe we haven't reached like optimal yet. Maybe, maybe as field size grows, as payout structure changes, maybe the optimal for BBM in the future is 1, 4, 12, 3. I don't even know if that adds up. Like, you know what I mean? We just don't know yet. So I think maybe like a reliancy, I think we can learn a lot. And there's been some fantastic research and work done, and I will never discredit any of that. I agree with a lot of it. Yeah. I just think maybe treating it as like 100% fact right now because it worked in the past is a little premature. I think we need to see these things play out a couple times over.
Yeah, I mean, just don't be as robotic. Like, don't be, automatically follow this set of rules when we know that not only do we not have a ton of information just based on the amount of slates that we've had with Best Ball Mania, but also year to year, things change within the fantasy landscape in terms of like how well certain positions perform. And then I talk about this all the time from a season long perspective. We always see this boomerang happen where, last year tight ends were pretty rough at the top when they were really good late. And then what happens this year? Tight ends are being drafted a little bit later at the top. And then that creates more of, to me, like your buying opportunity. Like, it's more about that and jumping on those advantageous trends as opposed to only looking at like, oh, this has worked over the last handful of years, so therefore it's going to work. I think it's just consuming all that information, and like anything else, don't consume it too much and take it too far, right?
Yeah, we talk about how it's a tool in our toolable. I was going to say tool basket. No, I'm clearly not
a little tool basket. No,
I'm clearly not a blue collar bro. But like in our toolkit, like it's just a piece of the puzzle, and none of this is absolute yet, right? Yeah. Like each of these slates is so dynamic and has so many moving, unquantifiable pieces and variants late and stuff because like. A lot can happen in a 5, 6, 7 month window between draft and games being played and whatnot, right?
Yeah. I got one more question for you. How tied are you to average draft position while you're drafting?
I mean, as the mug suggests, we're out here. We are out here scrolling. We are scrolling the F down all the time. I think I like to sum up ADP. It gets more efficient and the closest to accurate the later we are in the draft window, right? And that means earlier in the draft window, I want to be less tethered to it, and later in the draft window, I want to be more tethered to it. That being said, when piecing together the ownership puzzle at the back end of draft boards, I want to be less tethered to it late. So I think the things that we can all agree on with ADP is it matters most at the front end of draft boards, and it matters the least at the back end. And I think it matters the most the closer we are to the end of draft window, and it matters the least at the front end of draft window. So I think about it through the lens of when I'm drafting and what I'm trying to accomplish by drafting. I don't just scroll for the sake of scrolling. And I don't think like some of the uniqueness combinations that we have at the front end of or conversations we have about the front end of board uniqueness combos are like low-key overstated. But yes, I think that's kind of like in a vacuum how I think about ADP. And I love to scroll. I love to scroll at the back end and find that little like unique piece that differentiates.
Yeah, I've noticed too, and I've talked about this on Becoming a Best Ball Bro, like in the intros and stuff, how I've kind of shied away from doing slows, at least with Best Ball Mania, and I do fast because my brain is just so committed to that draft as I'm, doing it quicker, which is kind of counterintuitive to some people, but to me, it's like if you have a list, like I've maxed puppies and it's just hell, right? Like I'm waking up in the morning. I got my kids jumping on me, ready to eat breakfast. And I'm like trying to get through 45 drafts that I'm on the clock at. Right. And so, and when you do that, you just become a little bit more suboptimal and you're not really looking enough beyond a few spots of where your ADP is. Whereas I feel like when you're doing fast drafts, and you get to round 17, 18, you have a good feel for where your team is at. And where you need to get those ownership shifts and different like differences. Like in yesterday's live stream, I felt really there are some drafts you do where you're like through 17 rounds and you're like, I could literally pick anyone and it doesn't like I feel so good about where the build is that I don't need to force correlation. I could go either running back or wide receiver here. There's not really an obvious direction to go in. And I'm just like, I just picked Royce Freeman as an 18th round pick just to say like, all right, let's see what happens in Dallas. We've seen crazier things go on than Royce Freeman have a good week 16 or week 17, right? And so like that's been my biggest shift. And I do think that like going from more slows to more fast has been really, really helpful with that.
Yeah, another one another point to the slow versus fast dynamic is you pay way more attention to what people are doing in your room in the fast ones.
Yeah.
So if I fire up a slow and I look at a lobby, like I'm never going to go back into the lobby. I'm concentrated on my team, my isolated pick. I don't look back and see like, wow, the one hole's all over the place and doing crazy stuff and the 2 hole is auto drafting and whatever. Whereas if I'm in that room, I will know these factors and I will take some gambles in pushing a guy around the corner because I know someone won't snap him at ADP because he's getting creative, or I'll pay attention to the builds going on in my room. So I do feel very similar with you in terms of like, I do like my teams out of fast drafts more so than the ones out of my slow drafts. Also because when I have the rankings in for the slow drafts, I do just tend to, I did the work already.
Exactly.
Let me click up here. Right. Yeah. So I think it's a very astute point there.
Yeah, that's good. That's good that I'm thinking more and more like a best ball bro. Jon, this was awesome. People are going to really dig it. Let everyone know what you're doing, where they can find you and all that good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, you can follow me on the X there at roto_run. And then the Badge Bros. The Badge Bros is we do Underdog daily shows. So we're directly affiliated with Underdog, and we put out a show every single day. Some of them are behind a paywall, only $5 a month. I would like to remind everybody that it's only less than one Battle Royale entry to join up there. But we stream every single day on YouTube, Monday to Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern. And right now we're obviously doing a ton of best ball stuff, but we do full breakdowns of the MLB slates. We do some hoop stuff. We got some double dribble up there. We got some best puck stuff. I mean, we dabble in anything. If it's on the platform of Underdog, we'll be dabbling. So, yeah.
Yeah, you guys are crushing it. You can find me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Make sure you're taking advantage of the Underdog promo for the free late round draft guide. You can find that over on lateround.com. But otherwise, everyone, as always, thanks for tuning in.